The old Hollowbrook farmhouse sits like a rotting tooth against the Montana skyline, its windows boarded shut since 1975. That's when Sheriff Tom Bradley found them. 4 children, ages 6 to 12, huddled together in the basement, speaking a language no linguist could identify. Dr. Sarah Chen had read those words a dozen times in the past hour, but they still sent ice through her veins. The manila envelope had appeared on her San Francisco doorstep at 3 a.m., bearing no postmark, no return address, just her name written in spidery handwriting that looked decades old. Inside, photocopied police reports, medical files, and something that made her hands shake. DNA analysis sheets from 1975, stamped with the seal of a military genetics program she'd once worked for. A program that officially never existed. Sarah set down her coffee and pulled her reading glasses lower on her nose. At 73, retirement meant mornings spent tending her orchids and evenings reading mystery novels. It definitely didn't mean receiving classified documents about impossible children who should have been forgotten by history. The first photograph showed a young Sheriff Bradley standing outside the farmhouse, his face pale beneath his wide-brimmed hat. The second showed the basement where the children had been found, mattresses arranged in a circle, strange symbols carved into the wooden walls. The symbols looked almost like writing, but in a script that hurt to look at directly. Then came the medical reports. 4 children, Emma, age 6, Marcus and David, twins at 9, and Lily, the eldest, at 12. All malnourished, all traumatized, but physically perfect. Too perfect. Their bone density was 30% higher than normal. Their neural pathways showed development patterns that wouldn't be understood until decades later. And their blood. Sarah flipped to the genetic analysis, her breath catching. She'd seen these results before, 48 years ago, when she'd been a junior researcher fresh out of MIT and eager to serve her country. Back then, her supervisor, Dr. Morrison, had sworn her to secrecy before showing her the Hollowbrook files. Some things, he'd said, are too dangerous for the world to know. She'd been young enough to believe him. The DNA sequences sprawled across the page like alien poetry. 26 chromosome pairs instead of 23, genetic markers that carbon dating suggested were millions of years old, somehow preserved and active in living tissue. Cellular mitochondria that functioned with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, Dr. Chen. "We need to talk. The others are dying." Her blood turned to slush. Emma Hollowbrook. The 6-year-old from the basement, now 54 years old. Another buzz. Marcus died yesterday in Phoenix. David last week in Detroit. Lily's in a hospital in Portland, unconscious. I'm all that's left. Sarah's fingers trembled as she typed back. "How did you get my number?" "We've always known about you, Dr. Chen. You were there at the beginning. You saw what we are." The truth was, Sarah had never seen the children in person. By the time she'd been brought into the program, they'd already been separated and placed in foster homes across the country under new identities. The DNA samples had been her only contact with them, vials of blood that contained impossibilities. She remembered working late into the night, running test after test, certain there had been contamination, but the results never changed. The children's genetic code was human, but more than human, as if someone had taken the basic human template and improved it. "Meet me," came another text. "Coffee shop on Market Street. You know the one. You've been going there every Tuesday for 6 years." Sarah's skin crawled. She did go to Cafe Luna every Tuesday. Had someone been watching her all this time? She gathered the documents, her mind racing. In the original files, there had been speculation about the children's origins. Some researchers believed they were the result of secret government experiments. Others suggested exposure to unknown radiation or chemicals. But Sarah remembered Dr. Morrison's private theory, the one he'd shared only with her on his deathbed 5 years ago. "What if they're not aberrations?" he'd whispered in his hospital room. "What if they're predecessors? What if we found the descendants of something that came before us?" The idea had seemed impossible then. Now, Holding evidence that 3 of the 4 children had died in the past month, Sarah wondered if they'd been eliminated for a reason, and if she was next. Her phone buzzed one final time. "They're coming for you too, Dr. Chen. We're the last ones who know the truth. Don't trust anyone from the old program. They've been cleaning house." Sarah Chen looked out her window at the quiet San Francisco street, suddenly aware that the white van parked across from her house had been there all week. She had a choice to make. Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her palms against the steering wheel, watching the abandoned Kellner farmhouse materialize through the morning mist like something from a fever dream. 23 years of retirement had softened the edges of her scientific skepticism, but Marcus Webb's call had shattered that comfortable complacency in a single conversation. 4 children, impossible DNA, the government already circling. She killed the engine and sat in the sudden silence, studying the dilapidated structure. Paint peeled from its weathered siding like diseased skin, and broken shutters hung at odd angles. Yet something felt wrong about the decay, too uniform, too deliberate, as if the house had been aged rather than abandoned. Marcus emerged from the shadows of the front porch, his lanky frame more hunched than she remembered. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his usually pristine lab coat bore suspicious stains. Behind him, 2 figures in hazmat suits moved with military precision, collecting samples from the doorframe. "Sarah." He approached her car window, voice barely above a whisper. "Thank God you came." "You look like hell, Marcus." She stepped out, automatically checking the tree line for surveillance. "Old habits. How long since you've slept?" 72 hours, maybe more." He rubbed his stubbled jaw. "Time loses meaning when everything you know about human genetics gets turned inside out." They walked toward the house in silence, gravel crunching beneath their feet. The morning air carried an odd metallic tang, like copper pennies dissolved in rainwater. Sarah noticed the way Marcus kept glancing over his shoulder, the nervous tick of his left eye. Where are they now? The children? Secure facility, federal jurisdiction. His voice carried bitter resignation. "I've got maybe 6 hours before they shut down my access entirely. They're calling it a national security concern." Inside, the farmhouse told a different story than its exterior. The walls were scorched in perfect geometric patterns, radiating outward from 4 distinct points in the living room. The hardwood floors bore similar burn marks, but the wood hadn't charred. Instead, it had crystallized, forming fractal patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Jesus!" Sarah knelt beside one of the formations, pulling out a magnifying glass from her field kit. "What kind of heat signature creates this?" "That's just the beginning." Marcus led her deeper into the house. "The temperature readings don't match any known thermal event. But here's the really disturbing part. The DNA we extracted from these burn sites? It's degrading in real time, like it's being actively erased." They reached what had once been a kitchen. The refrigerator door hung open, its contents long since spoiled, but the smell wasn't of rotting food. It was organic. Yes, but unlike anything in Sarah's experience, sweet and cloying with an underlying note of ozone. Marcus pulled out a tablet, swiping through data that made Sarah's breath catch. "I've run the sequences 47 times, same results. The children's DNA contains genetic markers that shouldn't exist for another 100,000 years of evolution, maybe longer. That's impossible. Look at the mitochondrial analysis." He handed her the tablet. "Their cellular energy production is operating at nearly 300% normal efficiency. Their neural pathway development is off the charts. And Sarah, they're aging in reverse." She stared at the data, her mind reeling. The genetic sequences defied everything she understood about human development, about evolution itself. The children, 2 boys, 2 girls, ages appearing to be between 8 and 12, showed telomere lengthening that suggested cellular regeneration at an impossible rate. Where did they come from? That's the million-dollar question. No birth records, no missing persons reports. It's like they materialized out of thin air. Marcus moved to the kitchen window, peering through grimy glass toward the distant woods. But there's more. The soil samples around the property show mineral compositions that don't match local geology. We're talking about elements that barely exist in trace amounts on Earth. Sarah felt the familiar thrill of scientific discovery warring with a growing sense of dread. She'd spent her career pushing the boundaries of genetic research, but this transcended everything she'd ever encountered. This was something else entirely. The radiation readings? Negligible. Whatever happened here, it wasn't nuclear. Marcus turned back to her, his expression haunted. Sarah, I think we're dealing with something that challenges the very foundation of human origins. These children aren't just anomalies, they're evolutionary impossibilities. A sound outside made them both freeze. Car engines, multiple vehicles approaching fast. Through the window, Sarah could see black SUVs kicking up dust clouds as they barreled down the dirt road. They're early, Marcus whispered, quickly pocketing the tablet. We need to get you out of here. But even as they moved toward the back door, Sarah knew it was too late. Whatever secret lay buried in the DNA of those 4 impossible children, the government had decided it was worth killing for, and she had just become a liability they couldn't afford to ignore. The sound of boots on gravel echoed through the morning air like a death knell. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Dr. Sarah Chen adjusted her microscope for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. The blood sample from the girl they called Emma stared back at her through the lens, a crimson universe of impossibilities that made her question 40 years of scientific training. This can't be right, she muttered, switching to a higher magnification. The cellular structure remained stubbornly alien, each red blood cell carrying genetic markers that shouldn't exist in any human population on Earth. Behind her, the laboratory door hissed open. Agent Morrison's reflection appeared in the darkened computer monitor beside her workstation, his presence filling the sterile room like a storm cloud. Dr. Chen. His voice carried the weight of authority she'd learned to distrust during her years with the CDC. I trust you're making progress. Sarah didn't look up from her microscope. Science doesn't work on government timelines, Agent Morrison. These samples, they're unlike anything I've ever seen. Enlighten me. She finally turned, noting how Morrison's eyes immediately shifted to the classified folders spread across her desk. The man missed nothing, a quality that had likely served him well in whatever shadow agency employed him, but made her skin crawl. The mitochondrial DNA shows markers from multiple human subspecies that went extinct tens of thousands of years ago. Neanderthal, yes, but also Denisovan variants I can't even classify. It's as if these children carry the genetic memory of our entire evolutionary tree. Morrison stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor. Could they be the result of some kind of experimental breeding program? The question hung in the air like a toxin. Sarah had considered the possibility: forced genetic manipulation, illegal human trials conducted in some hidden laboratory. But the evidence suggested something far more disturbing. No. She pulled up a DNA sequence on her computer screen, the familiar double helix twisted into patterns that made her stomach clench. This isn't artificial manipulation. The integration is too perfect, too organic. These genetic combinations occurred naturally, but according to our understanding of human evolution, that should be impossible. Yet here we are. Sarah's fingers trembled as she scrolled through more data. 3 sleepless nights had brought her no closer to understanding, only deeper into a mystery that seemed to mock everything she thought she knew about human origins. There's something else, she said quietly. The telomeres, the protective caps on their chromosomes, they're significantly longer than normal human telomeres. If my calculations are correct, these children could theoretically live for centuries without aging. Morrison's expression didn't change, but she caught the slight tensing of his jaw. He'd been expecting this revelation, which meant either he knew more than he was telling, or someone else had made the same discovery. Have you shared these findings with anyone? The question carried an implicit threat that made Sarah's mouth go dry. She thought of her graduate student, Marcus, who'd helped process the initial samples before Morrison had him removed from the project. She thought of her colleague at Johns Hopkins, who'd left 3 increasingly worried voicemails that she hadn't returned. "No," she lied smoothly. "I understand the sensitive nature of this research." Morrison nodded, but his eyes remained cold. "Good. We'll need your preliminary report by tomorrow morning. Focus on potential origins, where these children might have come from." After he left, Sarah sat in the humming silence of the laboratory, staring at the genetic sequences that had consumed her thoughts for days. The official story claimed the children had been found in an abandoned farmhouse in rural Montana, malnourished and nearly feral, but the more she studied their DNA, the more convinced she became that their origins lay far beyond any earthly explanation. She opened a new file on her computer and began typing her real findings, not the sanitized version she'd give Morrison, but the truth that made her hands shake as she worked. The genetic markers pointed to something impossible. These children carried DNA from human populations that had supposedly died out before recorded history. More than that, they carried genetic information that suggested contact with something else entirely, sequences that matched no known terrestrial life form. The laboratory felt suddenly oppressive, its white walls closing in like a tomb. Sarah saved her work to an encrypted drive, her paranoia justified by the growing certainty that she'd stumbled onto something that powerful people would kill to keep secret. Outside, storm clouds gathered against the darkening sky, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the children in the secure wing upstairs were connected to something far larger and more terrifying than anyone suspected. Their DNA wasn't just an evolutionary anomaly, it was a message written in the language of life itself, and she was only beginning to understand what it was trying to tell her. The truth, when it finally emerged, would change everything. The basement laboratory of the CDC facility hummed with the steady drone of centrifuges and climate control systems. Dr. Sarah Chen had been staring at the same DNA sequencing results for 3 hours, her coffee long cold, her eyes burning from the blue glow of multiple monitors. The data made no sense. Worse than that, it was impossible. She rubbed her temples and pulled up the comparison analysis again. Human DNA contained roughly 3 billion base pairs, organized into 23 chromosome pairs. Standard, predictable. But the samples from the 4 children showed something that shouldn't exist, additional chromosomal material that didn't match any known human genetic markers, yet was clearly integrated into their genome as if it had always been there. "Still at it, Sarah?" She turned to find Dr. Marcus Webb, the facility's director, standing in the doorway. His usually pristine appearance looked rumpled, his tie loosened. He'd been fielding calls from Washington all day. "Marcus, I need to show you something." Sarah gestured to her screen. "Look at chromosome 14 in each of the children's samples." Webb moved closer, squinting at the genetic map. "What am I looking at?" "There's an additional sequence here, roughly 200,000 base pairs that don't exist in normal human DNA. But that's not the strangest part." Sarah pulled up another window. "This sequence? It's identical in all 4 children down to the last nucleotide. Not similar. Identical." Webb's face paled. "That's not possible. Even identical twins have some variation in their genetic expression." "Exactly. But there's more." Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard, bringing up a 3-dimensional protein model. "I ran the sequence through every database we have. The proteins this DNA codes for, they don't exist in nature. Not in humans, not in any known organism." The protein structure rotated slowly on screen, its complex folds and binding sites unlike anything in terrestrial biology. Webb stared at it, his scientific mind struggling to process the implications. Could it be contamination? Lab error? "I ran the sequences 5 times with different equipment. Had Jenkins verify my work independently." Sarah shook her head. "This is real, Marcus. These children have genetic material that appears to be entirely synthetic." Webb was quiet for a long moment, then pulled out his phone and scrolled through his messages. "Sarah, I need to tell you something." The calls I've been getting from Washington, they're not just about the children's medical care. There are people asking very specific questions about our findings. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. What kind of people? The kind that don't usually take interest in pediatric cases. Webb sat heavily in a nearby chair. I think we need to be very careful about how we proceed with this research. Before Sarah could respond, an alarm began blaring throughout the facility. Red lights flashed in the corridors, and an automated voice announced, "Code Blue, Level 3. Code Blue, Level 3. Webb jumped up. That's the children's ward. They ran through the corridors, joining other medical staff rushing toward the elevator. Sarah's mind raced as they ascended. The children had been stable since their arrival. Whatever was happening now couldn't be a coincidence. The third floor was chaos. Nurses and doctors crowded around the children's rooms, while Dr. Patricia Reeves, the attending physician, barked orders. Sarah pushed through to get a clear view and gasped. All 4 children were convulsing simultaneously, their small bodies rigid on their beds. But it wasn't a typical seizure. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, as if controlled by a single nervous system. Even more disturbing, their eyes had rolled back to show only the whites, and those whites were glowing with a faint, sickly phosphorescence. How long has this been going on? Webb demanded. Started about 5 minutes ago, Dr. Reeves replied, not taking her eyes off the monitors. All 4 at exactly the same time. Their brain activity is off the charts, but they're not responding to any of the standard seizure protocols. Sarah watched the synchronized movements with growing horror. The children's limbs jerked and twisted in perfect unison, as if they were marionettes controlled by the same puppeteer. The smell in the room was wrong too, a metallic odor that reminded her of ozone after lightning strikes. Their temperature is spiking, a nurse called out. 105 and climbing on all of them. Get ice packs now, Dr. Reeves ordered, and prep the cooling blankets. Sarah noticed something else. The children's hospital gowns were beginning to smoke at certain points, as if intense heat was radiating from specific locations on their bodies. She pulled out her phone and started recording, a scientist's instincts overriding her shock. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the convulsions stopped. All 4 children went completely still, their breathing shallow but steady. The phosphorescent glow faded from their eyes, and the acrid smell began to dissipate. In the silence that followed, Sarah realized that everything had changed. Whatever these children were, whatever had been done to them, they were far beyond normal human biology, and someone, somewhere, was very interested in keeping that secret buried. The basement laboratory of the farmhouse hummed with makeshift equipment Dr. Sarah Chen had managed to smuggle in over the past 3 days. Her portable DNA sequencer whirred quietly beside jury-rigged centrifuges and microscopes she'd borrowed from the university. The children sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, watching her work with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "The markers don't lie," she muttered, comparing the latest results to her initial findings. The impossible sequences remained consistent across every test. These children carried genetic information that shouldn't exist, chromosomal structures that belonged to no known primate lineage. Maya, the apparent leader of the 4, tilted her head with that unsettling bird-like motion. "You're frightened of what you're seeing." Sarah's hand stilled over the keyboard. "I'm a scientist. I follow evidence, not emotions. But the evidence frightens you because it suggests we aren't human." The girl's voice held no accusation, only stated fact. "We know what we are, Dr. Chen. The question is whether you're ready to accept it." The twins, Kai and Zara, moved in their synchronized fashion toward the laboratory equipment. Without being asked, they began organizing sample vials with mechanical precision, their movements perfectly mirrored. The 4th child, Ben, remained silent as always, but his dark eyes tracked every detail of Sarah's work. "The government teams will be back," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Agent Morrison seemed particularly interested in you 4. We need to understand what we're dealing with before they return." Maya's expression shifted. something almost predatory flickering across her features. Agent Morrison carries the scent of fear beneath his cologne. He knows more than he's revealing. They all do. Scent of fear? Sarah looked up from her laptop. That's an unusual way to phrase it. We notice things others miss, Zara said, her voice harmonizing with her twins as Kai continued. Pheromones, micro-expressions, electromagnetic fluctuations around electronic devices. Electromagnetic fluctuations? Sarah's scientific skepticism warred with growing unease. That's not possible for human senses to detect. Ben finally spoke, his words careful and measured. We aren't entirely human, Dr. Chen. The DNA should have made that clear. Sarah pulled up the genetic analysis on her screen. The anomalous sequences seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. Too organized to be random mutations, too complex to be evolutionary accidents. She'd run the samples against every database she could access, including classified military genetics research she probably shouldn't have been able to penetrate. Your DNA contains synthetic elements, she said slowly. Engineered sequences that don't exist in nature, but the organic components are equally impossible. Genetic information from species that went extinct millions of years ago. Maya nodded as if this revelation was expected. We remember fragments, not clearly, but enough to know we aren't the first. The first attempt to bridge the gap. The laboratory's lights flickered, and Sarah's equipment registered brief power fluctuations. She glanced at the children, noting how they'd all turned their attention toward the ceiling in unison. 3 vehicles, Kai said. Armed personnel, Zara added. Agent Morrison in the lead car, Maya concluded. He's brought specialists this time. Sarah felt ice in her veins. How could you possibly know that? Ben gestured toward the wall where Sarah's radio scanner crackled with static. We can hear their communications, not the words, the frequencies themselves. Human technology operates within predictable electromagnetic spectra. The scanner suddenly burst to life with clear transmissions. Beta team, secure the perimeter. Alpha team, prepare for specimen extraction. Dr. Chen is to be detained for debriefing. Sarah's hands flew across her equipment, frantically copying data files to encrypted drives. The children remained eerily calm, their strange luminescent eyes reflecting the laboratory's harsh fluorescent lighting. You knew they were coming, Sarah accused. We know many things, Maya said, including that you have a choice to make, Dr. Chen. You can surrender to them, provide your research, and spend the rest of your life in a government facility answering questions about us. Or, Sarah's fingers trembled as she sealed the drives in waterproof containers. Or, you help us reach the others. What others? Maya's smile was alien and terrible. The ones who came before us, the ones who created the original template. They're still here, Dr. Chen, waiting in places your government believes it controls. Vehicle doors slammed outside, followed by the sound of boots on gravel. Sarah realized she had perhaps minutes before the basement was breached. The choice is simple, Ben said, his young voice carrying ancient weight. Help us reunite with our predecessors and learn the true history of human evolution. Or remain ignorant while your species stumbles toward extinction, the twins said in perfect unison. Sarah stared at the 4 impossible children, their inhuman gazes fixed on her with patient expectancy. Outside, tactical teams prepared to storm the farmhouse. In her hands, she held evidence that would revolutionize everything science understood about life itself. The basement door splintered above them. The fluorescent lights in Dr. Sarah Chen's makeshift laboratory hummed with an electrical tension that seemed to mirror her own mounting anxiety. 3 days had passed since she'd smuggled the children's blood samples out of the government facility, and what she'd discovered in her basement lab defied every principle of genetics she'd learned in 30 years of research. She adjusted her microscope for the 100th time, hoping the image would somehow change, that her eyes had been playing tricks on her, but there it was again, DNA that shouldn't exist. The double helix structure was intact, but the base pairs were wrong, not just unusual or mutated, but fundamentally different, as if someone had rewritten the basic alphabet of life itself. The basement door creaked above her. Sarah's hand instinctively moved toward the emergency protocol she'd established, a single button that would incinerate all her research and samples. But the familiar shuffle of her husband's slippers on the wooden steps made her exhale slowly. "Sarah, you've been down there for 18 hours straight." Marcus appeared at the bottom of the stairs, carrying a steaming mug of coffee and wearing the concerned expression she knew so well. "I can't leave this, Marcus. What I'm seeing," she gestured helplessly at the computer screens displaying genetic sequences that looked more like complex mathematical equations than biological code. He set the coffee beside her and peered at the monitor. Marcus wasn't a scientist, but 43 years of marriage to one had given him a layman's understanding of genetics. "What am I looking at?" "The impossible." Sarah pulled up another sequence. "These children aren't human, at least not entirely. But they're not alien either. They're something else entirely, a bridge species." The words hung in the air between them. Marcus had always been her sounding board, the one person who could help her think through problems when the science became too overwhelming. But this was beyond anything they'd ever discussed. Bridge to what? Before Sarah could answer, her encrypted phone buzzed. The caller ID showed only numbers, Agent Morrison's emergency line. She'd been expecting this call since she'd left the facility, but it still sent ice through her veins. Dr. Chen Morrison's voice was clipped, professional, but Sarah detected an underlying urgency. "We need to talk. I told you everything I know at the debriefing." "We both know that's not true. My sources tell me you've been very busy in your retirement. Amateur genetics research can be dangerous, especially when it involves classified materials." Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. "They knew. Of course they knew. I don't know what you're talking about." 47 Elm Street, basement laboratory, microscope serial number 7749HX. "Should I continue?" Marcus's face went pale. Sarah closed her eyes, knowing their lives had just changed irrevocably. "What do you want?" "Cooperation." "And, Dr. Chen?" "We have the children." The line went dead. Sarah stared at the phone, her mind racing through implications and possibilities, none of them good. "We have to run," Marcus said quietly. But Sarah was already shaking her head, staring at the genetic sequences on her screen. "Look at this pattern here." She pointed to a series of base pairs that repeated throughout the children's DNA. "It's not random mutation, it's intentional modification." "Sarah, they're watching us. They know about the lab. We need to—" "Someone made these children." The realization hit her like a physical blow. This isn't evolution or alien intervention. This is engineering, human engineering. The implications cascaded through her mind. If humans had created these children, it meant the technology existed to rewrite DNA at the fundamental level. It meant someone had achieved what the scientific community considered impossible, and it meant the children weren't just anomalies. They were prototypes. Marcus grabbed her arm. "Whatever this is, it's bigger than us. We need to contact someone." "Who?" "Morrison's people are already involved. If this is a government project, then going to authorities is pointless." Sarah began copying files to an encrypted drive, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "But if it's not government-sanctioned?" She trailed off as another possibility occurred to her. The genetic modifications weren't random. They followed a pattern, building toward something specific: enhanced cognitive function, improved immune response, increased physical capabilities. Someone was creating the next step in human evolution. "We're not running," she said finally. "We're going to find out who's behind this and why." "Sarah, those children are being held by people who may or may not be their creators. Either way, they're in danger. And if this technology exists, if someone has figured out how to rewrite human DNA like computer code, then everyone is in danger." She ejected the drive and slipped it into her pocket. Above them, car doors slammed in their driveway. Multiple vehicles, multiple agents, Too late to run anyway, Sarah murmured, watching Morrison's tactical team surround their house through the basement window. But she was no longer afraid. She was angry. Someone had played God with human genetics, and she was going to find out who. The abandoned laboratory beneath the Meridian facility hummed with a low electronic pulse that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Dr. Sarah Chen followed Agent Morrison through corridors lined with sealed containment units, their surfaces fogged with condensation that obscured whatever lay within. The air tasted metallic, tinged with the sharp scent of preservation chemicals and something else, something organic and wrong. Project Synthesis began in 1987, Morrison explained, his voice echoing off the sterile walls. The same year, the Blackwood family disappeared from their farm. That wasn't a coincidence. Sarah's throat constricted. She'd suspected government involvement, but this level of premeditation chilled her to the bone. You're saying they were taken deliberately? Selected, Morrison corrected, based on very specific genetic markers we'd identified in the local population. Rural communities, isolated gene pools, perfect test subjects. They stopped before a massive vault door, its surface scarred with warning symbols in multiple languages. Morrison pressed his palm against a scanner, and the door unsealed with a pneumatic hiss. Beyond lay a chamber that defied the underground setting. It stretched upward like a cathedral, its ceiling lost in shadow. Banks of monitoring equipment lined the walls, their screens flickering with data streams Sarah couldn't decipher, but it was the central structure that stole her breath. A transparent cylinder, easily 20 feet tall, dominated the space. Inside, suspended in viscous fluid, floated something that had once been human. The body was elongated, its limbs stretched and distorted. Extra appendages branched from its torso like the arms of a sea anemone, each one ending in delicate, finger-like projections. Its skull was enlarged, translucent enough that Sarah could see the brain tissue within, brain tissue that pulsed with its own bioluminescent rhythm. The first successful integration, Morrison said quietly. Sarah Blackwood. She was 14 when we began the process. Sarah's legs nearly buckled. The name hit her like a physical blow. She'd read it in the missing persons report, seen the smiling photograph of a girl with pigtails and braces. This floating aberration shared nothing with that image, except perhaps the fine bone structure of the face, which remained hauntingly recognizable beneath the mutations. Integration with what? Sarah managed to whisper. We called it the collective, a distributed consciousness we discovered embedded in the local ecosystem. It had been there for decades, maybe centuries, slowly influencing the genetic development of certain bloodlines. We didn't create it, Dr. Chen. We just learned to harness it. The monitoring equipment around them suddenly blazed to life, screens filling with cascading data. The thing in the cylinder, Sarah, began to move, its multiple limbs undulating in the fluid. Its eyes, now completely black, fixed on Sarah with unmistakable intelligence. She knows you're here, Morrison observed. They're all connected, you see. Every successful integration becomes part of the network. The 4 children you've been studying, they're the latest generation, born from this. Sarah backed away from the cylinder, her scientific mind reeling. That's impossible. The children were found alone, abandoned. Their DNA shows non-human sequences because they're only partially human now. The collective doesn't replace human consciousness. It merges with it, enhances it, creates something new. Morrison's voice carried an edge of pride that made Sarah's skin crawl. The children you've been testing can communicate across vast distances, process information at superhuman rates, even influence the thoughts and behaviors of baseline humans. They represent the next phase of human evolution. They represent an abomination, Sarah snapped, finding her voice. You've destroyed these people's humanity. We've given them transcendence. Morrison moved to a control panel, his fingers dancing across the interface. The old world is dying, Dr. Chen. Climate change, resource depletion, societal collapse. Humanity needs to adapt or perish. The collective offers that adaptation. Around the chamber, other cylinders began to descend from the shadowy ceiling. Each one contained another figure suspended in fluid. Men, women, children, all bearing similar mutations. Sarah counted at least a dozen before losing track, her mind struggling to process the scope of what she was seeing. The Blackwood family was just the beginning, Morrison continued. We've been recruiting subjects from rural communities across the country for 35 years, building our population, refining the process. Sarah thought of Emma, Michael, David and Anna, their bright eyes and innocent faces hiding vast alien intelligence. The children I've been studying, how many more are there? Hundreds, scattered across foster systems and temporary facilities, waiting for their final integration. Morrison turned from the control panel, his expression almost sympathetic. You can be part of this, Dr. Chen. Your expertise could help us perfect the process, reduce the failure rate, make the transition easier for future subjects. The thing that had been Sarah Blackwood pressed against the cylinder wall, its mouth moving soundlessly. Sarah couldn't hear the words, but somehow she understood them anyway, a desperate plea for death echoing directly in her mind. You're insane, Sarah breathed, backing toward the entrance. All of you. Morrison's hand moved to his weapon. I'm afraid that's not an acceptable response. The children's drawings covered every surface of the safe house living room like a papyrus of nightmares. Dr. Sarah Chen stood among them, her coffee growing cold as she studied the intricate patterns that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. Geometric spirals merged with organic forms that hurt to contemplate too long. Each drawing contained the same recurring symbol, a double helix twisted through dimensions that shouldn't exist. They've been at it for hours, Marcus whispered from the doorway, careful not to wake the four small figures curled together on the couch. Even in sleep, their fingers twitched as if still drawing. Started right after you left for the lab. Sarah's latest blood work lay scattered across the kitchen table behind her, the results more disturbing than anything she'd discovered so far. The children's DNA wasn't just anomalous, it was actively rewriting itself. Each sample she'd taken over the past week showed progressive changes, as if something was awakening within their genetic code. The youngest one, Lily, she kept saying the same word while she drew. Marcus picked up one of the sketches, his hand trembling slightly. Confluence, over and over again. A 6-year-old shouldn't even know that word. Sarah felt ice settle in her stomach. She'd heard that term before, buried in her late husband's classified research notes. Project Confluence had been theoretical xenobiology, the study of how alien genetic material might integrate with human DNA. David had called it humanity's next evolutionary step, but the government had shut down his research after the Roswell files were declassified. A soft whimper drew her attention. The oldest child, Thomas, was sitting up on the couch, his eyes wide and unfocused. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made the windows vibrate. They're coming back. The gardeners are coming back to check their crop. The other children stirred, their eyes opening in perfect synchronization. Sarah approached slowly, her scientific mind warring with every instinct that screamed danger. Thomas, who are the gardeners? The boy's head tilted at an impossible angle, vertebrae popping like breaking twigs. The ones who planted us, the ones who planted all of you. But we're special. We're the hybrid seeds. We're almost ready to bloom. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. The children are not what they seem. Meet me at the old Hendricks farm. Come alone. A friend of David's. Marcus read the message over her shoulder. It's a trap. Has to be. But Sarah was already reaching for her coat. The Hendricks farm was where the children had been found, where this nightmare had begun. If someone had answers about David's research, about what was happening to these kids, she had to take the risk. Stay with them. Don't let anyone in. Sarah, you can't. Lock the doors. If I'm not back by dawn, take them and run. The drive to the farm took 40 minutes through back roads choked with fog that seemed too thick for the season. Sarah's headlights barely penetrated the grey wall, and twice she thought she saw shapes moving parallel to her car, tall, angular figures that vanished when she looked directly at them. The Hendricks farm materialized from the mist like a ghost ship. The farmhouse stood exactly as she remembered from the news footage, but now she could see what the cameras had missed. The soil around the foundation was wrong, black and oily, with a phosphorescent sheen that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. A figure emerged from the shadows of the front porch, tall, thin, wearing a military jacket that had seen better decades. As he stepped into her headlight beams, Sarah gasped. The man's face was familiar, not because she'd met him, but because she'd seen it in David's old research photos. Dr. Chen. I was hoping you'd be as curious as your husband, Colonel Morrison, but you're supposed to be dead. David said a lot of things, most of them true, unfortunately. Morrison gestured toward the farmhouse. We need to talk and we don't have much time. They know you've been analyzing the children's blood. Sarah followed him up the creaking porch steps. Inside, the farmhouse was gutted, but Morrison led her to a hidden basement she hadn't known existed. The walls were lined with equipment that hummed with alien purpose, machines that looked grown rather than built. Project Confluence didn't end when the government shut it down, Morrison said, his voice heavy with decades of regret. It just went underground. Literally. This farm sits on top of one of 12 sites where they made contact, where they've been conducting their experiment for the past 70 years. Sarah stared at the biomechanical computers that pulsed with the same rhythm as the soil outside. The children are the culmination of 3 generations of careful genetic manipulation. The aliens, we call them the gardeners, they've been slowly introducing their DNA into our population. But those 4 children, there's something new, something that was never supposed to happen. A low vibration began building in the walls around them. Morrison's face went pale. They're here. The harvest is beginning. Dr. Sarah Chen's hands trembled as she stared at the microscopic images on her laptop screen. The makeshift laboratory in Marcus Webb's basement felt like a tomb, the weight of discovery pressing down on her chest. What she had found in the children's blood samples defied not just human evolution, but the very timeline of life on Earth. The DNA sequences contained markers that shouldn't exist for another 1,000,000 years of evolution, genetic switches that nature had never learned to flip. Yet here they were, dormant but present, like a roadmap to humanity's impossible future written in the present. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of borrowed equipment. "Look at this." He leaned over her shoulder, his breath catching as she highlighted the anomalous sequences. "That's not possible. Those protein configurations—" "I know." Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard, cross-referencing the patterns with every genetic database she could access through encrypted channels. But there's more. These children aren't just genetically advanced, they're carriers. The basement door creaked open above them. Marcus reached for the pistol he'd taken from his security days, but it was only Emma, one of the 4 children they'd rescued. She descended the wooden steps with an otherworldly grace, her dark eyes reflecting light that wasn't there. "Dr. Chen," Emma said, her voice carrying harmonics that made Sarah's teeth ache. "You're beginning to understand." Sarah slowly turned in her chair. Over the past 3 days, she'd watched the children change. Their initial catatonic state had given way to an unsettling awareness, as if they were awakening from a long dream. Emma, the oldest at 12, had become their unofficial spokesperson. "Understand what, sweetheart?" Emma's smile was too knowing for a child's face. "We're not the first. The others are coming, but they won't be as gentle as we are." Marcus stepped forward, his hand still resting on his weapon. "What others? Who did this to you?" "You're thinking about it wrong," Emma replied, settling cross-legged on the concrete floor. "We weren't changed by someone. We're changing into someone. Something that was always meant to be." Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach. The genetic markers she'd found weren't random mutations, they were a pattern, a blueprint being activated across the human genome. "The other children from the facility," she said slowly. Where are they? Emma tilted her head, listening to something only she could hear. Scattered, hidden, growing. The process began decades ago, but the acceleration started when we were brought together. Physical proximity triggers the cascade. The laptop chimed with an incoming message. Sarah's heart sank as she read the encrypted communication from her former colleague at the CDC. Similar cases were being reported worldwide. Children with impossible DNA, adults experiencing rapid genetic alterations, entire families disappearing from government databases. It's spreading, she breathed. Spreading suggests disease, Emma corrected. This is emergence. Evolution doesn't ask permission. Marcus moved between Sarah and the child, his instincts screaming warnings his rational mind couldn't process. You're talking about replacing humanity. Humanity is replacing itself. Emma stood, and for a moment her shadow seemed to stretch beyond the reach of the overhead lights. We're just the preview, the prototype. Soon everyone will have to choose, adapt, or be left behind. Sarah's phone buzzed with an emergency alert. Government vehicles were being reported in the area, systematic searches of abandoned buildings and rural properties. Director Hayes had found their trail. We need to move, Marcus said, but Emma shook her head. Running won't help. They know what we are now, what we represent. The child's eyes had begun to glow with a faint bioluminescence. Dr. Chen, your research has confirmed what they feared most. We're not an anomaly, we're inevitable. Sarah stared at the genetic sequences still scrolling across her screen. Hidden within the impossible DNA was something else, something she'd almost missed. The activation markers weren't random, they followed a mathematical progression, a countdown encoded in flesh and blood. How long? She asked. 6 months until critical mass, Emma replied. After that, the change becomes irreversible for the entire species. Those who can't adapt will simply fade. The sound of helicopters echoed from above, growing closer. Marcus began shutting down equipment while Sarah frantically copied data to encrypted drives. The truth needed to survive, even if they didn't. Emma placed a small hand on Sarah's arm, and for an instant, the geneticist saw flashes of what was coming. Cities transforming, humans evolving in real time, a new form of consciousness emerging from the collective change. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. You have a choice to make, Dr. Chen, Emma said, as boots thundered across the floor above them. Help them fight us, or help us save what can be saved. The basement door exploded inward, flooding the space with harsh light and armed figures. Sarah clutched the drives containing humanity's most dangerous secret, knowing that her next decision would determine the fate of 2 species, the one dying and the one being born. The abandoned subway tunnels beneath Chicago stretched like arteries through the city's underground skeleton. Sarah pressed her back against the cold concrete wall, listening to the distant echo of footsteps somewhere in the darkness behind them. Marcus had his arm around Emma, who clutched the encrypted drive containing their research like a lifeline. How much further? Whispered Thomas, his young voice carrying despite his efforts to stay quiet. Dr. Chen consulted the hand-drawn map their contact had provided. 2 more stations, then we take the maintenance tunnel north. They had been moving through the tunnels for 3 hours since abandoning Chen's compromised safe house. The children, if they could still be called that, had adapted to the darkness with unsettling ease. Their eyes reflected the dim light from Sarah's flashlight like cats, and they moved with an almost preternatural awareness of their surroundings. Someone's following us, announced Lily, her head tilted as if listening to sounds beyond human perception. 3 people. They stopped moving about a minute ago. Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. The children's enhanced senses had proven unnervingly accurate throughout their escape. If Lily said they were being tracked, they were being tracked. We need to move faster, Marcus urged, but Chen shook her head. Not yet. If we run now, we'll make too much noise. They might be using sound detection equipment. Sarah studied the children in the pale beam of her flashlight. Over the past few days, she had watched them change in ways that went beyond physical development. Their genetic modifications weren't just activating, they were evolving in real time, responding to stress and environmental pressures with adaptations that should have taken generations. Dr. Voss, Thomas approached her with that strange adult composure that had become more pronounced since they'd fled the facility. I need to show you something. He held out his hand, palm up. In the dim light, Sarah could see what looked like tiny filaments extending from his fingertips, almost invisible threads that seemed to move independently. It started yesterday, he said quietly. I can feel electrical currents now. The building's wiring, your phones, even the bioelectric fields from our bodies. That's how we really know we're being followed. I can sense their heartbeats. Sarah stared at the boy's transformed hand, her mind racing through the implications. Thomas, this level of mutation, it's happening too fast. Your cellular structure shouldn't be able to adapt this rapidly without killing us? Emma finished, looking up from where she sat beside Marcus. We know. We can feel our bodies changing. It hurts sometimes, but we're also becoming something else. Something stronger. A sound echoed through the tunnel, the deliberate scrape of boot against concrete. Their pursuers were moving again. This way, Chen whispered, leading them deeper into the tunnel system. As they walked, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something crucial. The children's accelerated evolution, the government's desperate hunt, the mysterious origins of their genetic modifications, all of it pointed to something larger than a simple experiment gone wrong. Dr. Voss. Lily fell into step beside her. When we were at the facility, I accessed some of the computers while you were talking to the doctors. Lily, that was dangerous. I found files about other subjects, lots of them, dating back decades. The girl's voice carried a weight that no 12-year-old should possess. We weren't the first, and we're not the only ones. Sarah stopped walking so abruptly that Marcus nearly collided with her. What exactly did you find? Project Chimera has been running since the 1950s. Different phases, different approaches, but always the same goal: creating enhanced humans who could survive what they called the coming transition. What transition? Before Lily could answer, the tunnel erupted with light. Powerful beams cut through the darkness from both directions, trapping them in the intersection of two maintenance corridors. Dr. Sarah Voss, an amplified voice called out. By order of the Department of Evolutionary Security, you and your companions will surrender immediately. Department of Evolutionary Security. Sarah had never heard of such an agency, but the military precision of their operation suggested resources that went far beyond standard government departments. The children moved without discussion, positioning themselves in a defensive formation around the adults. Sarah watched in fascination and horror as their bodies began to change, muscles tensing, eyes dilating, and in Thomas's case, those strange filaments extending further from his fingers. Dr. Voss, the voice continued, you have 30 seconds to comply. The subjects are valuable but not irreplaceable. Sarah looked at Marcus, then at Dr. Chen, seeing her own grim realization reflected in their faces. Whatever the children were becoming, whatever Project Chimera had truly been designed to create, they had stumbled into something that powerful people were willing to kill to protect. The truth about human evolution wasn't just being hidden, it was being actively directed, and they had just discovered they were standing in the way of a plan decades in the making. The laboratory's emergency lights cast everything in a hellish red glow as Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her back against the cold metal wall, listening to the mechanical whirring growing closer. The facility's lockdown protocols had transformed their sanctuary into a maze of sealed corridors and automated defenses. The ventilation shaft, Marcus whispered, pointing to a grate near the ceiling. It's our only way out. Sarah shook her head, clutching the data drive containing the children's complete genetic sequences. We can't leave them. Whatever's happening to their bodies, it's accelerating. Through the reinforced glass of the containment room, she could see all 4 children suspended in what looked like cocoons of translucent organic material that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. The substance hadn't been there an hour ago. It was growing from their skin, responding to something in their altered DNA that defied every biological principle she knew. "Dr. Chen." Luna's voice emerged from the intercom, somehow calm despite being encased in the strange membrane. "You need to understand what we're becoming." Mechanical sounds stopped abruptly, replaced by footsteps. Human footsteps, but moving in perfect synchronization. Sarah's blood chilled as she recognized the implications. The government's special response team wasn't just here to contain the situation. They were here to harvest it. "The genetic markers you found," Luna continued, her young voice carrying an ancient weight, "they're not mutations, they're reversions. Humanity wasn't meant to evolve this way. We were redirected." Agent Morrison's voice echoed through the facility's speakers. "Dr. Chen, you've seen enough. Surrender the research and we can discuss your survival." Sarah looked at Marcus, who was frantically working to bypass the containment room's locks. The children's cocoons were becoming more opaque, and readings on the nearby monitors showed impossible vital signs, heart rates dropping to near-death levels while brain activity spiked beyond measurement. "There's something else," Sarah whispered into the intercom. "The electromagnetic signatures I detected in your neural patterns. They match readings we've found at other sites." "Other sites?" Marcus looked up from the control panel. Sarah's mind raced as pieces fell into place. The abandoned farmhouse hadn't been chosen randomly. The strange crystalline formations they'd found in the basement, the way the children seemed to know things they couldn't possibly know, the fact that their DNA contained sequences that shouldn't exist for another 1,000,000 years of evolution. "The children aren't the first," she said, the terrible truth crystallizing. "This has happened before, multiple times throughout history, but always in isolated incidents, always contained before." The lights suddenly returned to normal, and the containment room's seals disengaged with a pneumatic hiss. The cocoons split open simultaneously, revealing the children transformed. Their skin held a subtle luminescence, and their eyes reflected light, like mirrors. They moved with fluid grace, no longer quite human, but not yet something entirely other. "We remember now," Kai spoke, his voice harmonizing with frequencies that made Sarah's bones vibrate. "The others who came before, the ones who were silenced." David stepped forward, and Sarah noticed that his shadow fell in the wrong direction, as if light bent around him differently. "Your species was given a choice long ago, transcendence or stagnation. Those who chose transcendence were eliminated by those who feared change." The laboratory doors burst open, and Morrison entered with a team of soldiers in hazmat suits. But instead of weapons, they carried containers filled with the same crystalline material Sarah had seen in the farmhouse basement. "Impressive timing," Morrison said, seemingly unsurprised by the children's transformation. "We've been waiting 70 years for another emergence." Sarah felt the floor shift beneath her understanding. "You knew. You've always known." "The Prometheus Project has been monitoring and containing these evolutionary jumps since 1953, Morrison replied. "What you call children are actually humanity's next phase trying to break through. Our job is to ensure that transition happens on our terms." Emma, the youngest, tilted her head as if listening to something no one else could hear. "The signal is getting stronger. Others are awakening." Morrison's confident expression faltered. "That's impossible. We mapped every emergence point globally." "You mapped the old ones," Luna said with a smile that held too much knowledge. "But consciousness finds a way to evolve. The network is already established." Sarah watched in fascination and horror as the crystalline formations in Morrison's containers began to resonate, emitting the same electromagnetic frequencies as the children's transformed neural patterns. Around the world, she realized, others were beginning to change. The carefully controlled emergence Morrison spoke of was becoming something far larger. Marcus grabbed her arm. "Sarah, the readings are off the charts. Whatever's happening, it's not contained to this facility anymore. Through the laboratory's windows, Sarah could see lights appearing across the darkened landscape. Not electric lights, but the same bioluminescence now emanating from the children's skin. The transformation was spreading, carried by signals that traveled faster than any government response could contain. The next phase of human evolution had begun, and this time there would be no stopping it. The abandoned subway tunnel stretched ahead like a concrete throat, swallowing their flashlight beams into impenetrable darkness. Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her back against the damp wall, listening for any sign of pursuit from the streets above. The four children huddled close, their luminescent eyes cutting through the gloom with an otherworldly glow that no longer surprised her. "We can't stay here long," Marcus whispered, his 12-year-old voice carrying an authority that still unsettled Sarah. "They'll bring thermal imaging equipment soon." Sarah nodded, checking her phone for the coordinates David had transmitted before the safehouse raid. Her former research partner's final message had been cryptic: underground laboratory, Grid 7 Alpha, the truth about Prometheus. She'd spent the last 2 hours navigating the city's forgotten infrastructure, following David's breadcrumbs while government helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures. Elena, the youngest at 8, tugged on Sarah's sleeve. "Dr. Chen, the humming is getting stronger." The child's face was pale, her enhanced senses clearly overwhelmed by something Sarah couldn't detect. "What kind of humming?" Sarah knelt beside the girl, noting how the other children had grown similarly agitated. "Like singing," Elena whispered. "But not with voices, with thoughts." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. The children's telepathic abilities had been evolving rapidly since their escape from the containment facility. Whatever had been done to their DNA wasn't just creating new biological capabilities, it was fundamentally altering their consciousness. They pressed deeper into the tunnel system, following a maintenance access that sloped steadily downward. Sarah's GPS signal had died 20 minutes ago, but Marcus seemed to navigate by instinct, leading them through a maze of service corridors and forgotten passages that suggested this part of the city's underground had been abandoned for decades. There, Marcus pointed to a heavy steel door marked with radiation symbols and warnings in multiple languages. The locks had been recently cut, metal shavings still bright on the concrete floor. Beyond the door lay a sterile white corridor that hummed with hidden electricity. Emergency lighting cast everything in an amber glow, and the air carried the sharp scent of ozone and something else, something organic and wrong. Sarah's breath caught as they entered the first chamber. Banks of computer servers lined the walls, their displays showing streams of genetic data that made her earlier research look primitive by comparison. But it wasn't the technology that stopped her cold. It was the specimens. Dozens of transparent cylinders filled with bluish fluid stretched from floor to ceiling, each containing what appeared to be a human form in various stages of development. Some were clearly embryonic, barely recognizable as human. Others looked like children, their features serene in artificial sleep. And at the far end of the chamber, adult forms floated in their synthetic wombs, perfect and terrible in their inhuman beauty. "Project Prometheus," a familiar voice spoke from the shadows. Sarah spun to find Dr. Richard Hollowbrook emerging from behind the server banks, his government credentials hanging from a lanyard around his neck. The man who had authorized the children's capture, who had turned her life's work into a weapon, looked older than she remembered, his face drawn with exhaustion or guilt. "You led us here," Sarah realized, her hand instinctively moving to shield the children. "This was all a trap." "No." Hollowbrook's voice was hollow. "I led you to the truth. David contacted me before he died. Yes, Dr. Chen, David Martinez is dead, shot trying to access these files." He gestured to the grotesque nursery around them. "He wanted you to see this, to understand what we've really been doing." The children had moved to stand in front of the specimen tanks, their glowing eyes reflecting in the curved glass. Sarah noticed they showed no fear, only a strange recognition, as if they were looking at family members. "These aren't experiments," Sarah whispered, the horrible truth crystallizing. "They're products. You're manufacturing them. The DNA modifications we found in your 4 subjects, we didn't create them," Hollowbrook continued. "We reverse-engineered them. The original genetic template came from elsewhere, from outside." Elena pressed her small hand against one of the tanks, and the specimen inside, a child roughly her age, opened its eyes. They blazed with the same inner light, the same impossible intelligence. Across the chamber, other specimens began awakening, responding to some signals Sarah couldn't comprehend. "The humming," Elena said softly. "They're dreaming together." Hollowbrook moved closer, his voice urgent. "The children you've been protecting aren't human, Dr. Chen. They're the first of their kind, harbingers of something we're only beginning to understand. And now that they're fully conscious, now that they're networking with each other—" Alarms suddenly blazed through the facility, red lights strobing across the white walls. The specimens in their tanks began moving more vigorously, and Sarah felt a strange pressure building in her mind, like fingers probing at the edges of her thoughts. The children turned toward her in perfect unison, their luminous eyes reflecting not just light, but something far more ancient and purposeful. Whatever was awakening in this underground horror show, Sarah realized with growing dread, she had just helped it take its first breath. The laboratory's emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her back against the cold steel wall, listening to the rhythmic footsteps echoing through the corridors above. Agent Morrison's tactical team had breached the facility faster than she'd anticipated, but the children's transformation had bought them precious time. Maya floated 3 feet off the ground, her eyes now completely white, crackling with an energy that made the air itself hum. The other 3 children stood in a perfect triangle around her, their hands extended, creating some kind of protective barrier that shimmered like heat waves. When Morrison's men had tried to enter the lab, their weapons had simply dissolved into metallic dust. "Dr. Chen." Maya's voice carried harmonics that shouldn't have been possible from a human throat. "We need to show you something before they take us." Sarah's tablet still displayed the impossible DNA sequences, but now additional data was streaming across the screen, information that seemed to be coming directly from Maya's mind. The genetic markers she'd been analyzing weren't random mutations. They were coordinates. "Coordinates to what?" Sarah whispered, though she wasn't sure she'd spoken aloud. "Home," said Thomas, his young face serene despite the chaos around them. "Our real home." The tablet's screen shifted, displaying a 3-dimensional star map. A pulsing dot marked a location roughly 47 light-years from Earth in the constellation Cassiopeia. But as Sarah studied the display, she realized the coordinates weren't pointing to a planet. They were pointing to a massive artificial structure, something that dwarfed entire solar systems. "The nursery," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of boots on metal stairs. "Where we came from, where others like us are waiting." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Others? How many others?" "Thousands," said David, his eyes reflecting the emergency lighting like a cat's. "Hidden among your species for generations, waiting for the signal to return." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. The children weren't random genetic anomalies. They were part of something much larger, a reconnaissance mission that had been ongoing for decades, perhaps centuries. But reconnaissance for what? Maya's feet touched the ground as the energy around her intensified. "The harvest is coming, Dr. Chen. Our people need new genetic material, fresh DNA to prevent the degradation of our species. Earth was chosen long ago." The footsteps above had stopped, replaced by a more ominous sound, the whine of charging energy weapons. Morrison's team had brought something specifically designed to counter the children's abilities. "They're not here to capture us," Thomas said, tilting his head as if listening to something only he could hear. "Agent Morrison received new orders 23 minutes ago. Termination protocol." Sarah's hands shook as she gripped the tablet. Everything she thought she understood about the situation had been wrong. The government wasn't trying to study the children. They were trying to prevent something far worse than she'd imagined. The missing children from the other locations, Sarah said, pieces falling into place. They weren't taken by your people, were they? No, Maya confirmed. They were eliminated by yours. Governments around the world have known about us for decades. They've been systematically hunting us down, preventing us from reaching maturity, because once you mature, you can contact your ship. Not just contact, Elena corrected. Guide it here. The laboratory's main door exploded inward, showering them with debris. Morrison appeared in the doorway, no longer wearing his government suit. Instead, he was encased in some kind of powered armor that hummed with electromagnetic energy. Behind him, his team carried weapons that looked like they belonged in Sarah's worst science fiction nightmares. Dr. Chen, step away from the subjects. Morrison's voice was mechanically distorted through his armor's speakers. You've learned too much to be allowed to live. The children's protective barrier flared brighter, but Sarah could see it wavering under the assault from Morrison's energy weapons. Whatever technology the government had developed, it was specifically designed to neutralize the children's abilities. You're making a mistake, Sarah called out. If you kill them, their ship will know something happened. You'll bring the very invasion you're trying to prevent. Morrison's laugh was cold and metallic. The invasion is already here, Doctor. These 4 are just the cleanup crew. Their job was to eliminate the evidence of our victory. Sarah's mind reeled. Victory? We've been fighting this war for 60 years, Morrison said, his weapons charging with increasing intensity ever since the first ship arrived. Humanity won, Dr. Chen. We captured their technology, reverse-engineered their weapons, and systematically eliminated their infiltrators. These children are the last loose ends. Maya's white eyes fixed on Sarah with desperate intensity. He's lying. The war never ended. It's about to begin. The children's barrier began to collapse under the sustained assault, their young faces contorting with effort and pain. Sarah realized she had perhaps seconds to make a choice that would determine the fate of both species. Her finger hovered over the tablet's transmission key, ready to broadcast everything she'd learned to the world. The underground bunker's emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as alarms shrieked through the corridors. Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her back against the cold concrete wall, clutching the stolen data drive containing everything. The truth about the children, about Project Genesis, about humanity's engineered origins. They're in Section C. A voice crackled through someone's radio nearby. Lock down all exits. Sarah's heart hammered as she peered around the corner. 3 soldiers in tactical gear swept the hallway with their weapons raised. She'd managed to slip away during the chaos when the children had somehow triggered a massive power surge, but her luck wouldn't hold much longer. The 4 children were somewhere in this labyrinth, and she had to find them before Director Hartwell's men did. The data she'd uncovered painted a terrifying picture. The children weren't anomalies or evolutionary leaps. They were prototypes, the latest iteration in a program that had been running for decades. And if Hartwell's communications were accurate, there were dozens more facilities just like this one. A distant explosion shook the bunker, dust raining from the ceiling. The lights flickered, and in that moment of darkness, Sarah saw something that made her blood freeze. A figure moved past the soldiers, tall, gaunt, with elongated limbs that bent at impossible angles. One of the children, but changed somehow, evolved beyond what she'd seen before. The soldiers never saw it coming. By the time their flashlights found the corridor again, 2 of them were down, their necks twisted at grotesque angles. The third was backing away, his rifle shaking in his hands. "Control, this is Team 7, he whispered into his radio. "We need immediate backup. The subjects, they're not children anymore." Sarah felt bile rise in her throat. What had they done to those kids? The genetic modifications she'd discovered in the data were extensive: enhanced cognitive function, accelerated healing, increased strength and speed. But this transformation was beyond anything in the files. She forced herself to move, creeping through the service tunnels she'd mapped during her weeks of captivity. The bunker was a maze, but she'd studied every blueprint Hartwell's people had carelessly left accessible on the internal network. Her destination was the central laboratory where they'd first brought the children. As she crawled through the narrow maintenance shaft, she could hear screaming echoing through the vents. Not the children, the soldiers. Whatever was happening down here, Hartwell was losing control of his own facility. The shaft opened into a storage room adjacent to the main lab. Sarah dropped down quietly, her joints protesting after the cramped crawl. Through the observation window, she could see into the laboratory proper, and what she witnessed there defied comprehension. The children stood in the center of the room, but they were no longer entirely human. Their bodies had elongated, their skin taking on a translucent quality that revealed the modified circulatory system beneath. Most disturbing were their eyes, completely black now, like looking into deep space. But they weren't alone. Around them, arranged in a perfect circle, were at least 20 other figures, adults, or what had once been adults, in various stages of the same transformation. Some still bore traces of their former humanity, while others had progressed so far that their original forms were barely recognizable. The reunion was always planned, a familiar voice said behind her. Sarah spun to find Dr. Marcus Webb, her former colleague and the man who'd first recruited her to examine the children. But like the others, he had changed. His face was gaunt, his eyes that same terrible black. "Marcus," she whispered, "what have you done?" "What we were always meant to do," he replied, his voice carrying harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. "Humanity was never meant to be the final stage, Sarah. We were merely the incubator." The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. The children hadn't been found in that farmhouse. They'd been placed there. The whole discovery had been orchestrated to draw in someone with her expertise, someone who could complete the final phase of the project. "The genetic modifications," she said. "They're not random. They're following a specific pattern. A pattern we've been implementing for over a century," Webb confirmed. "Each generation more advanced than the last. The children you've grown so fond of, they're Generation 12, but their purpose was never to remain children." On the other side of the glass, the transformed beings had begun to emit a low, resonant hum. The sound seemed to vibrate through Sarah's bones, awakening something deep in her cellular structure. She looked down at her hands and gasped. Her veins were becoming visible, darkening beneath her skin. "The exposure was gradual," Webb explained. "Every interaction with the children, every sample you analyzed, every breath you took in their presence. The transformation is already beginning." Sarah stumbled backward, but found her way blocked by two more of the changed ones. Through the laboratory window she saw the children, the original 4 she'd tried so desperately to protect, turned toward her with those bottomless black eyes. They weren't looking at her as their protector anymore. They were looking at her as their next recruit. The underground laboratory hummed with an otherworldly frequency that made Sarah's teeth ache. Behind walls of reinforced concrete and steel, Dr. Marcus Webb's true work revealed itself in all its horrifying glory. Rows of cylindrical tanks filled with amber fluid lined the chamber, each containing what appeared to be developing embryos in various stages of growth. 23 years, Webb said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. 23 years of careful cultivation, selective breeding, genetic manipulation, and you 4 were my greatest success. Sarah's hand found Emma's shoulder, pulling the girl closer as they stood transfixed by the nightmare surrounding them. The other children, Marcus, Lily and David, remained unnaturally calm, their dark eyes reflecting the eerie bioluminescence emanating from the tanks. "Success?" Dr. Chen's voice cracked. "You call this abomination success?" Webb laughed, a sound devoid of humanity. "You always lacked vision, Elena. Even at Stanford you were content with mundane discoveries. But I saw the potential in the Chernobyl samples, in the genetic anomalies we found in the exclusion zone." The pieces clicked into place for Sarah with sickening clarity. The radiation hadn't just mutated the local flora and fauna, it had awakened something ancient in the human genome, something that had been dormant for millennia. "The children aren't evolving forward," she whispered. They're reverting, back to something we used to be. Precisely. Webb's eyes gleamed with fanatic fervor. Homo sapiens is an evolutionary dead end, a brief failed experiment. But these children carry the genetic memory of our predecessors, enhanced and refined. They are what we were meant to become. Emma's grip tightened on Sarah's hand, and for a moment, Sarah felt something impossible, a direct transfer of thought, emotion, understanding. The sensation was overwhelming, alien, and utterly terrifying. "They're not the first," Emma's voice whispered directly into Sarah's mind. "There were others before us. Failed attempts. They're in the tanks." Sarah's blood ran cold as she looked more closely at the suspended forms, not embryos, children, dozens of them floating in chemical wombs, their development arrested at various stages. Some bore the same ethereal features as the 4 survivors, while others displayed grotesque mutations that had clearly gone wrong. The farmhouse was never their home, Dr. Chen said, her scientific mind working despite the horror. It was a testing ground. A graduation ceremony, Webb corrected. These 4 proved they could survive without technological support, could adapt to primitive conditions while maintaining their enhanced capabilities. They passed every test. Agent Morrison, who had remained silent since their capture, finally spoke. "The government knows, doesn't it? That's why they wanted them contained, not studied." Webb's smile turned predatory. "Contained? Oh, Agent Morrison, you've been fed such charming lies. The government doesn't want them contained. They want them replicated. Mass-produced, a new breed of soldier, of citizen, of human being entirely." The laboratory suddenly shuddered, dust raining from the ceiling as something heavy moved overhead. Emergency lighting flickered on, bathing everything in hellish red. "Sir," a technician called from a bank of monitors, "we have multiple breaches in the upper levels. Unknown personnel moving through sectors 7 through 12. Webb frowned, his confidence wavering. "Impossible. This facility is classified beyond top secret." Marcus stepped forward, his young face serene despite the chaos. "We called them," he said simply. "The others like us. We're not alone anymore." The temperature in the room plummeted as the lights began to strobe wildly. Through the observation windows, Sarah caught glimpses of movement in the corridors beyond, figures that moved too quickly, too fluidly to be entirely human. "How many?" Webb demanded, backing toward a security console. "Enough," Lily replied, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in Sarah's bones. "You thought 4 was your greatest success, but we were just the beginning, the first of many to awaken." The main doors exploded inward with a sound like thunder. Through the smoke and debris came others, children and young adults who shared the same otherworldly features, the same impossible grace. Their eyes held ancient intelligence, and as they moved, they communicated in ways that transcended speech. Webb scrambled for a weapon, but David raised his hand, and the scientist simply stopped, frozen in place like a statue. "Your experiments are over," the boy said with authority that belonged to someone far older. "Your understanding of evolution, of humanity itself, was flawed from the beginning." Sarah felt the world spinning around her as the newcomers moved through the laboratory, their presence somehow both comforting and terrifying. They began interacting with the tanks, their touch causing the amber fluid to drain away as they gently extracted the suspended forms within. "What happens now?" she managed to ask. Emma looked up at her with eyes that held depths of knowledge Sarah couldn't fathom. "Now we remember who we really are," she said, "and help you remember too." The facility continued to shake as more of them arrived, and Sarah realized they were witnessing not just an escape, but an awakening that would reshape everything humanity thought it knew about itself. The helicopter's rotors thundered overhead as Dr. Sarah Chen pressed herself against the concrete wall of the abandoned grain silo. The children huddled behind her, their luminescent eyes reflecting fear in the dim moonlight. Marcus gripped her shoulder, his breathing ragged from their desperate flight through the cornfields. "They're using thermal imaging," he whispered, pointing to the searchlight sweeping methodically across the landscape below. "We can't stay here." Sarah's mind raced through their dwindling options. The government facility they'd escaped from 12 hours ago would have mobilized every resource to recapture the children. Director Hawthorne had made it clear that the project's secrecy was worth more than their lives. The data she'd stolen, the complete genetic sequences, the breeding records, the horrifying timeline spanning decades, it all pointed to a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power. "Dr. Chen," whispered Lily, the youngest of the 4 children. At 8 years old, she possessed cognitive abilities that surpassed most adults, her DNA containing genetic markers that shouldn't exist in nature. I can hear their thoughts. They're coming from 3 directions. The other children, twins Alex and Emma, and their older brother David, formed a protective circle around Lily. Sarah had witnessed their abilities firsthand during their captivity: telekinetic manipulation, accelerated healing, shared consciousness. They weren't entirely human, but they weren't alien either. They were something far more terrifying: humanity's engineered future. "The underground tunnels," Marcus said suddenly, remembering the old grain transport system that ran beneath the farmland. "If we can reach the access point near the river." A burst of automatic gunfire erupted from the tree line, muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness. Soldiers emerged from the corn, their night vision goggles glinting like insect eyes. Sarah counted at least a dozen figures advancing in formation, weapons trained on their position. "Move!" she hissed, pushing the children toward the silo's rear exit. They burst into the open, running low across the exposed ground. Sarah's lungs burned as she struggled to keep pace with the unnaturally agile children. Behind them, shouts echoed as the soldiers spotted their movement. The helicopter banked sharply, its searchlight lancing through the air to pin them in a circle of blazing white light. David, the oldest at 14, suddenly stopped running. His eyes flared with an inner radiance that Sarah had only seen once before, during the facility's failed containment breach. The air around him began to shimmer with barely contained energy. "David, no!" Emma screamed, reaching for her brother. "You'll burn yourself out." But David was already channeling whatever force lay dormant in his altered genetics. The helicopter's engines sputtered as electromagnetic interference rippled outward from his position. Sparks cascaded from its control panel, and the aircraft lurched sideways, fighting to maintain altitude. The soldiers raised their weapons, but Alex stepped forward, his twin sister Emma joining him. Together they projected a telekinetic barrier that deflected the incoming bullets, the projectiles spinning harmlessly into the night sky. Sarah watched in horrified fascination as the children's abilities manifested in ways the facility's scientists had never documented. "The tunnel entrance!" Marcus shouted, pointing to a rusted grate partially hidden by overgrown weeds. He wrenched it open, the metal shrieking in protest. One by one they dropped into the narrow passage below. Sarah went last, pulling the grate shut just as boots pounded overhead. The tunnel was pitch black and reeked of decades of stagnant water and decay, but it offered their only chance of escape. They crawled through the cramped space, guided by Lily's enhanced senses. The child could navigate the branching passages with impossible precision. Her consciousness somehow interfaced with the underground network in ways Sarah couldn't begin to comprehend. "There's something else," Lily whispered as they paused at a junction. "I can feel others like us. Many others. They're calling to me." Sarah's blood ran cold. The documents she'd stolen had referenced Project Genesis, a broader initiative spanning multiple facilities worldwide. If there were more children, more genetic experiments, then what they'd uncovered was only the beginning. Water splashed around their knees as the tunnel began to slope downward toward the river system. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but Sarah knew their respite was temporary. Hawthorne would never stop hunting them. The secret they carried was too dangerous, the implications too vast. As they emerged from a drainage outlet into the moonlit river, Sarah realized the true scope of what they were fighting. The children weren't just victims of illegal experimentation, they were prototypes, the first generation of a new species designed to replace Homo sapiens. And somewhere in the shadows of government black sites and corporate laboratories, more were being created. The helicopter's searchlight swept past their hiding spot beneath the concrete overhang. In 18 hours, they were supposed to meet Sarah's contact at the Canadian border. 18 hours to expose the truth before the next phase of human evolution was decided by those who viewed humanity as nothing more than raw genetic material to be improved upon. The laboratory's emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as Dr. Sarah Chen watched her life's work crumble around her. The servers housing decades of genetic research sparked and died, victims of the electromagnetic pulse she'd triggered to prevent the government from seizing the children's DNA samples. Through the reinforced windows, she could see black helicopters circling like mechanical vultures. "Mama Sarah, are we going to die?" whispered Kira, the youngest of the 4 children, her impossibly large eyes reflecting the crimson glow. Even now, faced with imminent capture, Sarah marveled at how the girl's pupils seemed to contain swirling galaxies. "Not if I can help it," Sarah replied, though her voice carried more conviction than she felt. She turned to Marcus, the eldest at 12, whose developing telepathic abilities had grown stronger each day. "Can you sense how many are coming?" Marcus closed his eyes, his brow furrowing with concentration. When he opened them again, his expression was grim. 37 soldiers. They're moving through the building now, and Dr. Voss is with them. Sarah's blood chilled. Dr. Helena Voss, her former colleague, had sold them out to the Department of Genetic Security. The woman who'd once shared Sarah's wonder at scientific discovery had been seduced by government promises of unlimited funding and resources. "The tunnel," Sarah said, leading the children toward the hidden panel she'd hoped never to use. "It connects to the old subway system. We can—" The laboratory door exploded inward, metal fragments scattering across the floor. Soldiers in black tactical gear poured through, their weapons trained on Sarah and the children. Behind them walked Dr. Voss, her once kind face now cold and calculating. "Hello, Sarah," Voss said, stepping over the debris. "You've led us quite a chase." Sarah positioned herself between the soldiers and the children, feeling their small hands clutch at her lab coat. "These are children, Helena. They're not specimens." Voss laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Children? You of all people know what they really are. They're the next phase of human evolution, perhaps even post-human. Their genetic code contains sequences that shouldn't exist on Earth." "Because they don't," Sarah said quietly. The admission hung in the air like a confession. Voss's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "Explain." Sarah felt Marcus's hand squeeze hers, a silent communication. The boy was preparing something, gathering his strength. She needed to buy him time. "The farmhouse where we found them," Sarah began. "It wasn't just abandoned. It was a landing site. 30 years ago, something came to Earth. Not an invasion, but refugees. The children's parents weren't human in the traditional sense, but they were human enough that interbreeding was possible." "Interbreeding with what?" Voss demanded. "With us," Sarah said. "With humans who'd left Earth millennia ago, who'd evolved on distant worlds, who developed abilities we can barely comprehend. They came back, but they were dying. The children are hybrids, the last link between what we are and what we could become." Voss stepped closer, her scientific curiosity overriding her caution. "Prove it." That's when Marcus struck. The boy's eyes blazed with inner light as every electronic device in the room began to malfunction. Radios screeched with feedback, weapon targeting systems failed, and the soldiers stumbled as their communication implants overloaded. "Run!" Sarah shouted, grabbing Kira while pushing the other children toward the hidden tunnel. But they were too late. Agent Morrison, the government's lead field operative, had been waiting in the shadows. His weapon discharged with a soft whisper, and Sarah felt the tranquilizer dart pierce her neck. Her vision blurred as she collapsed, watching helplessly as similar darts found their targets. The last thing she saw before unconsciousness claimed her was Voss kneeling beside the fallen children, already drawing blood samples with practiced efficiency. Sarah awoke in a white room that smelled of antiseptic and despair. Through a one-way mirror, she could see the children in adjacent cells, each connected to monitoring equipment that recorded their every biological function. Kira was crying silently, her tears leaving phosphorescent trails on her cheeks. A door opened behind her. Voss entered, carrying a thick file. "They're magnificent," Voss said without preamble. "Their neural activity suggests cognitive abilities far beyond human norms. Kira's tears contain compounds that could revolutionize medicine. Marcus's brain scans show structures that don't exist in Homo sapiens. And you're going to dissect them for it," Sarah said flatly. "I'm going to study them, to learn from them, to unlock the secrets that could elevate our entire species." Sarah looked at her former friend with profound sadness. "You still don't understand. They're not here to be studied, Helena. They're here to teach us, but only if we're worthy students." Through the glass, Marcus turned to look directly at Sarah, his eyes bright with purpose. In that moment, she realized the children had allowed themselves to be captured. They had a plan, and somehow she was part of it. The real revelation was just beginning.